Kia ora, ko Louis Collins aho. No mai ki te whare, welcome to the House. When bills arrive in Parliament that seek to change how the public service operates, they very rarely make any dent in the political news cycle. Even MPs would likely concede that reforms in this area can often be fairly humdrum, a reshuffling of the bureaucratic furniture, you might say. Based on its name alone, I wouldn't blame you for thinking that the Public Service Amendment Bill was much the same, but in fact it proposes some fairly significant changes. The bill sits squarely under the National Party's policy refrain of back to basics.
This bill will ensure the public service refocuses on delivering for taxpayers by getting back to basics. It starts with refocusing the purpose of the public service to getting back to basics. This bill will ensure the public service is focused on getting back to basics.
But what does that actually mean in practice? The most substantive changes relate to provisions around DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion. Here's the Minister in charge of the bill, Judith Collins, outlining some of those provisions.
We're strengthening the Act to make sure that the best person for the job is the one who gets it. Not the most familiar or the easiest option, but the person with the right skills and experience to deliver. For this reason, the bill will no longer allow public service chief executives to be automatically reappointed. All roles will be subject to a full contestable process so that the widest possible pool of talent can be considered. This important change will make sure we get the right person for the job every time.
Second readings give MPs the opportunity not only to consider any changes recommended by the Examining Select Committee, but also to reflect on what the public had to say during the submissions process. Labour's spokesperson for the Public Service, Camilla Bellich, who also chairs the Governance and Administration Committee, used that stage to draw attention to the submissions her committee received on the bill. Bellich cited those submissions to argue that when it came to merit-based appointments, the government might be fixing a problem that perhaps didn't really exist.
Of course, we stand for merit-based appointments, but this was scrutinised in quite a lot of detail at Select Committee, and there was not one single example that any of the advisors could give us as to a situation where someone hadn't been appointed on the basis of merit within the New Zealand Public Service. And despite that, Mr Speaker, we are able to have a public service to date that largely represents the community that they serve. Those two things can be true alongside each other, that we can have the best people for the job and that they can represent the diverse community that is New Zealand. And this bill assumes that I think, is not the case, and I think that's a shame.
DEI has increasingly become a battleground issue across Western democracies. Whether directly inspired by developments overseas or not, removing diversity provisions in favour of strictly merit-based appointments was part of the coalition agreement between National and New Zealand First. For the latter party, spokesperson Andy Foster focused much of his contribution on the removal of DEI, something his party leader has framed as a winnable front in a broader war on woke. In the context of this bill, that meant removing the requirement for the public service to be representative of the community it serves. Here's Foster.
The bill replaces a clause in the Act. The clause says to work with public service leaders to develop a highly capable workforce that reflects the diversity of the society it serves and to ensure fair and equitable employment, including by promoting the good employer requirements of this Act. And the new clause just says, work with public service leaders to develop a highly capable workforce and to promote the good employer requirements of this Act. It's quite a clear difference in the approach that's being taken because we're about the outcomes that our public service delivers.
Labour's Aisha Verrill also addressed the removal of that provision.
The bill also removes the requirement for the public service to reflect the population of New Zealand. And I wonder what is so threatening about that. There is absolutely nothing wrong with the idea that in addition to merit, the public service should represent New Zealand. I see groups from all across New Zealand come to interact with the public service and feel at times that they are not heard. We certainly see a lot of that from Māori communities' experience of engagement with the public service. We hear it from Asian communities' experience of engagement with the public service. With rural communities, why shouldn't that diversity be reflected in the public service?
Verrill then went a step further, drawing a comparison that echoed opposition concerns that so-called culture war policies, such as waging a war on woke, are being imported from political debates playing out overseas, particularly in the US.
But this government seems to have a problem with that, and perhaps mostly reflected by their love of Trumpian talking points.
The final speaker in the second reading was National's Ryan Hamilton, who used a schoolyard analogy to illustrate what he sees as the merits of meritocracy.
Madam Speaker, when I was at school and we'd play sports in primary school, you'd pick two captains organically amongst yourselves, and then you choose who you wanted on your team. And you wouldn't pick the Māori boy or the Chinese boy or the girl. Out of diversity, you'd pick the ones that would help you win the game. And that was all about merit. Just like we're celebrating the Olympics, Madam Speaker, we don't have 3 gold medals, we have 1. Imagine if Labour's socialism got into Olympics. God help us.
Thanks, Louis. Kia ora, Kōwhio Smith aho. Over the last 2 years, the government has broken many legislating records, fuelled by higher use of urgency and of extra sittings. As a result, it would not be surprising if by this point the Prime Minister's to-do list had been whittled down to a nub. But Parliament shows no signs of slowing its legislative pace. In this first real debating legislation week of the year, the government included an extra morning sitting, pushing aside the Thursday select committees to instead go into the House to debate bills.
I move that the sitting of the House today be extended into tomorrow morning for the continuation of government orders of the day numbers 1 to 7.
An extra morning sitting each week has become the norm rather than the exception. This week, the government hoped to progress as many as 10 different pieces of legislation, but 3 of those bills were moved through multiple stages. 2 were strongly contested, while the 3rd was unanimously supported. We've talked previously about the Public Service Amendment Bill, but let's talk about the other 2. The unanimously supported bill is about Anzac Day. It widens the definition of who Anzac Day commemorates, moving it from specific veterans, from only some conflicts, to all who have served. No party is against that idea, and the speeches on that bill are quite something. The 3rd bill was less convivial.
Here we are again, another week, and another government bill that's putting a wrecking ball to the rights of workers in this country.
That was Jan Tinetti opening her second reading speech on the Employment Relations Amendment Bill. It finished an interrupted second reading debate on Tuesday, and then it wrestled its way through a long committee of the whole stage on Wednesday evening, and then again on Thursday morning. It was, as you might have noticed, contentious. But it was also a tad one-sided.
Madam Speaker, thank you. While the Employment Relations Act, Madam Speaker, has indeed provided important protections,
here's National's Rema Nakle in the second reading.
Over time, some of these settings have created unintended costs and risks for employers. So what this bill and the changes proposed in this bill does is it rebalances the system, Madam Speaker, so that it works fairly for both employees and employers. I commend this bill to the House.
That wasn't a boil down of her speech, by the way. That was the whole speech. To aid the government's desire for speed, coalition backbenchers say almost nothing on most bills, 30-40 seconds, which gives them scant experience and doesn't really help get the government's point across. In the usual reading debates, the heavy lifting is left to the minister in charge, who tends to be the only governing MP who uses their full 10 minutes. On this bill, to get that, we need to reach back 2 weeks to when the Minister for Workplace Relations spoke, and that would be ACT MP Brooke van Velden.
The bill, as reported back, remains focused on the same 4 core areas. These are providing greater certainty for contracting parties, strengthening the consideration of accountability for the employee's behaviour in the personal grievance process, providing an income threshold for ineligibility for unjustified dismissal personal grievances, and removing the 30-day rule to improve freedom of choice and cut red tape at the beginning of employment. Together, these changes will improve labour market flexibility across the spectrum. The bill introduces a new gateway test that provides a clearer and more efficient legal test for clear-cut, genuine contracting arrangements, which gives weight to the intention of contracting parties. This is a significant step forward for business certainty. The committee has recommended some refinements to the gateway test criteria to reflect the realities of contracting work. The gateway test now explicitly covers situations where a business facilitates work for a third party. This ensures that the gateway test is fit for purpose for contemporary platform-based working arrangements that offer job and income without direct contractual obligations in that relationship. For the intention criterion, the test now clarifies that a business can specify in the written agreement that the worker is either an independent contractor or not an employee. This means businesses that don't classify workers as independent contractors can still use the gateway test. For the restriction criterion, the test makes clear that contracting a worker for full-time work will not in of itself constitute a restriction on working for others.
And from this week, putting another side on the same information, Labour's Camilla Ballich.
Uber workers in New Zealand united and took a case to the Supreme Court against a huge multinational company. And, Madam Speaker, they won. And what is this government doing? It is reversing their win through this terrible act, this terrible piece of legislation that will take those hard-won gains that those Uber workers made in the Supreme Court and effectively turn those around through the introduction of this gateway test. The test for who is an employee is something that is common throughout Commonwealth jurisdictions. It looks to the real nature of the work, which should be the test that we use. The test in this bill reverses that and makes it much easier for employers to say, you are not an employee, you don't get holiday pay, you don't get parental leave, you don't get sick leave, you don't get the minimum wage, you don't get anything because you're not an employee. That is what this bill does. Now, the 30-day rule is going to be abolished by this particular bill, and it essentially means that when you start in a job, instead of being covered by the collective employment agreement, you won't be covered by that agreement at all, and you'll most likely be covered by an individual employment agreement unless you decide independently to join a trade union. Now, the reason that that is really important is because what a lot of employment contracts have in them, individual employment contracts, is they have a trial period. So essentially a 90-day period where, similarly to what will be introduced here, you have absolutely no rights at all, and you can be sacked for any reason at all.
There had been thoughts about trying to get the Employment Relations Amendment Bill finalised on Thursday, but the government opted for a third reading of the Anzac Day Bill instead, which is appropriate in a debating chamber that is, in effect, a giant war memorial. Despite that, it was still a more upbeat debate and a more convivial one than the alternative. You've been listening to The House. It's a whakarango koe ki te whare. This program is produced with funding from Parliament's Office of the Clerk.